The light was dying, bleeding out across the immense, bruised sky in streaks of orange and violet. Aunt May stood at the edge of her small porch, a lone figure in a dress the color of a poppy, the vibrant red a stark and lonely defiance against the dun-colored earth. The day's heat still clung to the air, thick with the scent of dust and dry sagebrush. This was her ritual, to watch the sun surrender to the jagged peaks of the mountains that walled in her world, to feel the vastness of her solitude settle over her like a shroud. It was in this suspended moment, between the furnace of day and the chill of night, that she saw it. Down by the creek bed, where the willows grew thin and desperate, was a shape that did not belong. It was not a deer come for a final drink, nor a coyote slinking through the gloaming. It was a heap of dark cloth and stillness, a human form sprawled half in the shallow, murmuring water. Fear, cold and immediate, coiled in her stomach. Her first instinct, born of years of caution and isolation, was to retreat, to bar the door and pretend she had seen nothing. This land did not reward curiosity, it punished it. But then the shape moved, a pathetic, shuddering motion, and a low groan reached her, carried on the same breeze that rustled the silk of her cheongsam. It was the sound of a life clinging to its last thread. She hesitated for only a breath longer, her mind a maelstrom of risk and responsibility. Her husband, gone 2 years now, had warned her. "This place has no memory for kindness," he'd said, his voice already growing weak. "It only remembers weakness." But what she saw was not weakness, it was ruin. To leave him there was to become as merciless as the landscape itself. Taking a steadying breath, she picked up the hem of her dress and descended the creaking wooden steps. Each footfall on the path seemed unnaturally loud in the growing quiet. As she drew closer, the scale of him became apparent. He was immense, a true mountain of a man, with a wild tangle of long, dark hair and a beard that covered most of his face. His clothes were buckskin and leather, soaked through with water and something darker. A wide, viscous stain spread from his side, coloring the creek water a faint pink downstream. He was unconscious, his breathing a ragged, shallow thing. His face, what she could see of it, was pale beneath a sun-scorched tan. He was a stranger, and everything about him screamed of violence and trouble. He was being hunted, or had been left for dead by his own. Bringing him into her home was an invitation for that trouble to follow. It was madness. Aunt May knelt beside him, her small, slender fingers hovering over the raw wound in his side. It was a deep, vicious gash, cleaved by a blade, not a bullet. The choice was simple and impossible. Leave him to the buzzards in the night and live with the ghost of her own inaction, or take him in and risk everything. She looked from his still face to the unforgiving mountains, then back. She had lost her husband to a fever this land gave and would not take back. She could not stand by and watch it claim another soul. With a resolve that felt like both courage and foolishness, she made her choice. She would not let him die. The effort to move him was monumental. He was a dead weight of muscle and bone, far heavier than he looked, and she was a small woman, built for grace, not brute strength. She hooked her arms under his, her face pressed against the damp, leathery smell of his vest, and pulled. He slid from the water with a sickening wet sound, his body leaving a dark smear on the dusty bank. For a moment she thought she would fail, that he was simply too large, too inert. Her arms screamed, her back ached with a fire she had not felt in years. But desperation was a powerful fuel. Grunting, straining, she dragged him inch by painful inch up the slight incline toward her cabin. The red silk of her dress was smeared with mud and his blood, the hem torn on a thorny bush. The journey of 50 yards felt like a mile. By the time she hauled him over the threshold of her door, she was trembling with exhaustion, her breath coming in ragged sops. She let him fall to the floorboards, the thud echoing in the sudden, profound silence of her home. The cabin was her sanctuary, a small, meticulously ordered space in a world of chaos. Polished wood, neatly stacked tins of tea, a simple cot, and her embroidery frame standing like a sentinel in the corner. Now, this huge, bleeding man lay sprawled in the middle of it all, an intrusion of brutal reality into her fragile peace. She barred the door, her heart hammering against her ribs, and leaned against it, gasping for air. The finality of the act settled upon her. He was inside. The world was shut out, but the danger was now locked in with her. She lit a lamp, the warm yellow light pushing back the encroaching darkness and revealing the full extent of his injury. The gash was long and deep, the edges already inflamed. It needed cleaning. It needed stitching. He would die of infection if she did nothing. Her mind, numb with exertion, slowly began to work. She remembered her mother, in a life so distant it felt like a dream, grinding herbs in a stone mortar, her voice a low hum as she explained their properties. Willow bark for fever, yarrow to staunch bleeding. Old wives' tales, perhaps, but they were all she had. She moved with a renewed, if anxious, purpose. She stoked the fire in her small stove, setting a kettle to boil. From a carved wooden box she took out dried bundles of herbs, their faint dusty scent filling the small room. She crushed them with a pestle, her hands moving with an old, ingrained memory. The man on her floor groaned, his head tossing from side to side. Aunt May froze, watching him. In the flickering lamplight she could see the lines of pain etched around his eyes and mouth. He was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps 30, his features sharp and strong beneath the beard. He was someone's son, perhaps someone's husband. The thought brought a fresh pang of grief for her own lost love, a wound that never truly healed, but only scarred over. This act of mercy was, she realized, a balm for her own soul as much as for his body. It gave a purpose to her hands beyond mourning. It filled the crushing silence. The work was intimate and gruesome. With a cloth soaked in hot water, she began to clean the wound, wiping away the blood and grit. He flinched, a deep growl rumbling in his chest, but he did not wake. His skin was hot to the touch. Fever was already setting in. She worked methodically, her focus narrowing to the task at hand, blocking out the fear of who he was and what bringing him here might mean. She was no longer a lonely widow in a remote cabin. She was a healer, a mender. The world shrank to this small circle of lamplight, to the scent of blood and herbs, to the sound of his ragged breathing and the thumping of her own heart. When the wound was as clean as she could make it, she threaded a needle, the same fine needle she used for her intricate silk embroidery. Her hands, which could trace the delicate feather of a bird's wing in thread, now had to pierce and pull together the edges of human flesh. She paused, the needle hovering over his skin. A wave of nausea and doubt washed over her. What was she doing? She was a scholar's daughter, a merchant's wife, not a surgeon. But the alternative was to watch him die. She took a breath, steadied her hand, and pushed the needle through. He arched his back with a strangled cry, his body going rigid. Aunt May whispered to him, soothing words in a language he wouldn't understand, the same soft murmur she used to use with her husband when the fever dreams came. "It's all right," she said, her voice barely audible. "Be still. Just be still." She worked quickly, her stitches small and neat, a grim parody of her usual craft. Each pass of the needle was a violation, yet an act of preservation. She bound the wound tightly with clean strips of linen, then mixed the crushed herbs into a paste and smeared it over the bandage, hoping the poultice would draw out the heat and fight the poison. Finally it was done. She sat back on her heels, slick with sweat, her entire body aching. He seemed to have settled, his breathing a little less strained. She managed to get him onto her own cot, a feat of leverage and sheer will. She covered him with a thin blanket and then collapsed into her one wooden chair, too exhausted to move. The lamp sputtered, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. The man on her cot was a stranger, a vessel of unknown violence, yet she had touched him with a tenderness she thought had died with her husband. She had stitched his body. Now she could only pray that his life would hold. The silence returned, but it was different now. It was a shared silence, heavy with the presence of another heartbeat, another life hanging in the balance within her four walls. She watched him through the long hours of the night, waiting for the fever to break or to claim him. Fear, pride, and a terrifying, unfamiliar hope warred within her. 3 days passed in a feverish haze, for him and for her. Aunt May rarely slept, dozing in her chair, waking at every sound from the cot. She forced sips of willow bark tea and thin broth between his cracked lips. He drifted in and out of consciousness, muttering words she couldn't catch, his big body racked with shudders. On the third morning, she woke to find him watching her, with one hand so he could drink. He drank with one hand so he could drink. He drank greedily, his gaze never leaving her face. The silence was thick with unspoken questions. He was a wild thing brought to heel, wary and assessing. She was his keeper, his savior, and just as wary. Later that day, as she was changing his bandage, the sound came. Hoof beats. Not the slow, ambling pace of a lone rider, but the rhythmic, purposeful beat of several horses moving together. Panic, sharp and electric, seized her. They were coming here. Her cabin was the only structure for miles in this direction. She looked from the window, where a small plume of dust was rising in the distance, to the man on the cot. He had heard it too. He was already trying to sit up, his face a mask of grim understanding. "No," she hissed, pushing him gently back down. "You cannot be seen." His eyes darted around the small room, searching for an escape that didn't exist. Then her gaze fell upon the worn rag rug in the center of the floor. Beneath it was the small root cellar, a dark, cramped space where she kept potatoes and preserves. It was their only chance. "You must hide, quickly." Getting him off the cot and across the floor was a frantic, agonizing process. He was weak, leaning heavily on her, his breath catching with pain. Every second was an eternity. The hoofbeats were louder now, closer. She pulled back the rug, revealing the square trap door. She lifted it, the scent of damp earth rising to meet them. He looked down into the darkness, then back at her. For a moment she saw pure desperation in his eyes, the look of a cornered animal. "Go," she urged, her voice a strained whisper. He lowered himself into the hole, his large frame barely fitting. She handed him a water skin before closing the door, the wood settling into place with a soft thud. She quickly rearranged the rug, smoothing it out, her hands shaking so badly she could barely control them. She took a deep breath, wiped the sweat from her brow, and forced herself to her embroidery frame just as a hard knock rattled the door. "Ma'am?" a man's voice called out, firm and official. "Marshal Croft, we'd like a word." She pressed a hand to her chest to still her racing heart, composed her face into a mask of placid neutrality, and walked to the door. She had crossed a line. There was no going back now. Her secret was buried beneath the floorboards, and the law was at her door. She opened the door just wide enough to see them. 2 men sat on their horses, their shapes dark against the bright, unforgiving sun. The one who had spoken, the marshal, was a lean, hard-faced man with eyes that seemed to miss nothing. His badge glinted, a small star of authority. The deputy beside him was younger, his face less severe but equally watchful. Aunt May kept her expression calm, a slight, questioning tilt to her head. She did not speak. "Afternoon, ma'am," the marshal said, his voice polite but without warmth. He dismounted, his boots crunching on the dry ground. "Sorry to bother you. We're looking for a man. Goes by the name of Boon. Big fella, long hair. Might have passed this way." He was describing the man in her cellar perfectly. A cold dread washed through her, but she held his gaze, her face a carefully constructed blank canvas. She gave a small, slow shake of her head. "I see no one," she said, her voice soft, the accent of her homeland clinging to her words. It was a useful tool. People often equated it with simplicity, with a lack of understanding. The marshal's eyes scanned past her into the dim interior of her cabin. His gaze lingered on the cot, the rumpled blankets, the single chair. He noted the order, the cleanliness. "You live out here all alone?" he asked. She gave a slight nod. "My husband is gone." "Sorry to hear that," he said, though his tone was perfunctory. His eyes continued to sweep the room, cataloging everything. They rested for a moment on the rag rug in the center of the floor. Her heart leaped into her throat. It was just a rug, but in that moment it felt as conspicuous as a mountain. It felt as if the shape of the man beneath was visible through the woven fabric. She held her breath, certain he would ask her to move it, certain he could hear the frantic beating of her own heart, or worse, the strained breathing of the man hidden below. The deputy shifted on his horse. "Nothing out back, Marshal. Tracks lead down to the creek and then they vanish." Marshal Croft's gaze finally lifted from the rug. He looked at her again, his expression unreadable. "This man Boon, he's wanted for robbery and murder. He's dangerous. If you see or hear anything, you send word to the town. You understand?" She nodded again, a simple, obedient gesture. "I understand." He seemed to hesitate, as if weighing her story, his suspicion warring with the placid image she presented. He glanced once more at the rug, a flicker of doubt in his eyes, before he seemed to dismiss it. The cabin was too small, too neat. The woman too frail. It didn't fit. "All right, then," he said finally, turning to remount his horse. "Good day, ma'am." She watched them ride away, not allowing herself to relax until their dust plume had become a faint smudge on the horizon. Only then did she shut the door and lean against it, her legs weak with relief. The immediate danger had passed, but the encounter had left a residue of terror. They would be back. The marshal's final, lingering look had promised it. Boon emerged slowly, climbing out of the cellar door, her hands fumbling with the iron ring. "They are gone," she whispered into the darkness as she lifted the heavy wooden panel. Boon emerged slowly, climbing out of the cramped space, his face pale and beaded with sweat. He leaned against the wall, breathing heavily. He looked at her, his gray eyes filled with a new understanding. The abstract threat that had brought him to her door was now a shared reality. "They'll be back," he rasped, his voice a low gravel. It was a statement, not a question. "Yes," she said, helping him back to the cot. The room felt charged, the air thick with their conspiracy. She met his gaze, her own dark eyes unwavering. "You were dying." That night they spoke for the first time with something other than the language of patient and caregiver. The shared danger had forged a fragile bridge between them. She brought him a bowl of thin rice porridge, and he ate it slowly, his eyes still on her. The silence in the room was no longer empty, but filled with a watchful curiosity. "Boon," he said, his voice stronger than before. He tapped his own chest. "My name is Boon." It felt like an offering, a piece of himself given in trust. She nodded, a small, shy smile touching her lips for the first time in days. "Aunt May." He tried the name, the syllables foreign on his tongue. "Aunt May," he repeated, his voice softening the edges. Thank you. The words were simple, but they landed with the weight of a solemn vow. Gratitude was a currency she had not dealt in for a long time. It warmed a cold place inside her she thought had frozen over. She sat in her chair, taking up her embroidery hoop, the familiar motion of the needle a comfort. He watched her hands as they moved, the silk thread flashing. What they said, he began, his voice low. The marshal. He paused, choosing his words. Some of it is true. I took something, but I didn't kill anyone. They shot first. He wasn't asking for her belief, just stating his truth into the quiet air of the cabin. She didn't look up from her stitching, but she heard the raw honesty in his tone. She had already decided his guilt or innocence didn't matter. What mattered was the man in her care, the life she had chosen to save. You must rest, she said softly. Your body needs to heal. The days that followed settled into a quiet, clandestine rhythm. He was growing stronger. The color returned to his face, and he began to move around the small cabin, his large frame making the space feel even smaller. He was restless, a creature of the open mountains confined to a cage. But he was patient. He watched her grind her herbs, watched her cook, watched her hands fly over her embroidery. He learned the cadence of her quiet life. He never spoke of where he came from or where he was going, and she never asked. Their communication was in small gestures. He learned to anticipate when she needed the water bucket refilled and, despite her protests, would limp to the door and fill it from the rain barrel, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. She, in turn, learned the subtle signs of his pain and would have the willow bark tea ready for him without a word being spoken. One afternoon, he picked up a piece of her embroidery, a half-finished crane, its wings outstretched. He ran a calloused thumb over the delicate silk threads, his touch surprisingly gentle. It's beautiful, he said, his voice filled with a quiet awe. My mother taught me, she replied, her voice distant. A long time ago, in another country. He looked at her, at the striking red dress she wore like armor, at her elegant, composed features. He saw not just a woman who had saved him, but a woman who was as displaced in this harsh land as he was. They were two solitary islands, temporarily joined by a current of circumstance. The trust between them deepened, unspoken but solid. It was in the way he would instinctively move toward the cellar when a hawk cried out, mistaking it for a signal, and the way she would shake her head with a small, reassuring smile. It was in the way she no longer flinched when his large frame brushed past her in the tight quarters. The cabin became a world unto itself, a fragile bubble of peace suspended in a landscape of threat. But they both knew the bubble could not last. Every sunrise was a gift, and every sunset a warning. The mountains were calling him home, and the law was still hunting. The hoofbeats returned a week later, just after dawn. This time there was no warning plume of dust. They came from the direction of the foothills, their sound muffled by the terrain until they were almost upon the cabin. Aunt May's blood ran cold. She and Boon exchanged a single panicked look. There was no time. The cellar, she breathed, already moving toward the rug. He was faster this time, his movements more fluid, though a sharp intake of breath told her the sudden motion pained him. He slipped into the dark hole just as the first shout came from outside. "Hello, the house!" It was the marshal's voice, sharp with impatience. Aunt May threw the rug over the trap door, her hands trembling as she tried to straighten it. It looked crooked, bunched up. She didn't have time to fix it. A heavy fist pounded on the door, making the whole frame shudder. "Open up! We know you're in there!" She pressed her palms to her cheeks, forcing a flush of sleepiness, mussed her hair, and shuffled to the door. She opened it to find not 2, but 4 men. Marshal Croft stood on her porch, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. His eyes were like chips of ice. "Ma'am," he said, his voice dripping with false courtesy. "We have a warrant to search this property and all surrounding outbuildings. We have reason to believe you are harboring a fugitive." He held up a piece of paper. The words were meaningless. The threat was in his eyes. He didn't wait for her permission, but pushed past her into the cabin. The other men fanned out, one heading toward her small goat pen. The marshal's gaze swept the room, more invasive this time. He saw the single cot, the one chair. But he also saw 2 cups on the small table. He pointed a finger at them. "Expecting company?" he sneered. "I like tea," she said, her voice small but steady. His eyes narrowed, then fell again to the rug. He walked over to it, his boots heavy on the floorboards. He stood directly over the trap door. Aunt May felt the air leave her lungs. It was over. Time seemed to stop. The only sound was the sound of the wind. The marshal bent down, his fingers hooking into the edge of the woven fabric. Time seemed to stop. The only sound was the ticking of the small clock on her shelf and the frantic pounding of her own blood in her ears. He was going to lift it. He was going to find him. And then what? They would take him, and they would take her too. Her life, her fragile peace, would be shattered. "Marshal!" a shout from outside. "Over here!" Croft froze, his fingers still clutching the rug. He straightened up, a flicker of annoyance on his face. "What is it?" "Found something down by the creek. Looks like a fresh campsite. Smoldering fire." The marshal's head snapped toward the door. A campsite. A new lead. He looked back at Aunt May, then at the rug, his suspicions still churning. For a long, agonizing moment he stood there, torn. The silent, stoic woman, the extra cup, the crooked rug. It was all circumstantial, but a smoldering fire was evidence. With a grunt of frustration he made his decision. "Let's go," he barked to the man inside with him. He gave Aunt May one last hard look, a look that promised this was not over. "We'll be back," he said, the words a cold vow. Then he was gone, his boots thumping down the steps. She stood rooted to the spot, listening as their horses galloped away, the sound fading into the vast silence. Only when she was sure they were truly gone did she allow herself to collapse into her chair, her body shaking uncontrollably. It was not a reprieve. It was a stay of execution. That night the air in the cabin was thick with unspoken finality. They both knew he had to leave. The marshal's promise to return hung over them like a guillotine. Another search would be more thorough. Their luck would not hold twice. Aunt May began to prepare for his departure, moving with a quiet, somber purpose. She took a small canvas satchel and began to fill it. A pouch of dried meat, a small bag of rice, a handful of her precious herbs for tea and for his wound. She refilled the water skin she had given him in the cellar. Every item she packed was a prayer for his survival. Boon sat on the cot, watching her. He had seen men prepare for journeys his whole life. Men checking their rifles, sharpening their knives, their movements hard and practical. He had never seen a departure prepared with such gentle, meticulous care. He felt a strange ache in his chest, a feeling so foreign he didn't have a name for it. His life had been one of harsh necessity, of taking what he needed to survive. This selfless giving was a language he was only just beginning to understand. He watched her fold a fresh linen bandage, her slender fingers moving with practiced grace. The same hands that had stitched his flesh back together were now packing him sustenance for the wilderness. He was a force of nature, a man of rock and pine, and she was a still, deep pool of water. He had fallen into her world, broken, and she was giving him back to the mountains, mended. "I have nothing," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Nothing to give you for this." She paused, her back to him, the red of her dress a warm glow in the lamplight. She did not turn around. "To be alive is enough," she said softly. He stood up, his wound pulling, and walked to where her embroidery frame stood. He looked at the unfinished crane, its wings spread as if about to take flight. He thought of the marshal, of the lie she had told, the immense risk she had taken for a man she did not know. He thought of the quiet companionship, the shared meals, the trust that had grown in this tiny, fragile space. "It's not enough for me," he said. He reached out, his large, calloused hand hovering near her shoulder, but he did not touch her. The space between them crackled with everything they couldn't say. "Go tonight," he said. "When the moon is go tonight," he said. "When the moon is down." She nodded, still not looking at him. She finished packing the satchel and placed it on the table. The preparations were complete. All that was left was the leaving. The silence that fell was heavier than any before, filled with the weight of imminent loss and the bitter truth of their separate paths. The sky was a black, star-dusted canopy, the moon a barely there sliver hidden behind the peaks. It was time. Boon stood at the open door, a huge silhouette against the night. The cool air, smelling of pine and distant rain, washed into the warm cabin. He had the satchel slung over his shoulder. He was healed, not whole, but strong enough to run, to climb, to disappear back into the wilderness that was his only home. Aunt May stood a few feet away, her arms wrapped around herself. Spoke of gratitude, respect, and a deep sorrowful regret. He turned to her, his face shadowed, but she could feel the intensity of his gaze. "Aunt May," he said, his voice low and resonant. He reached out, and this time he did touch her. His fingers gently brushed her cheek, a touch so light she barely felt it, yet it sent a tremor through her. His hand was rough, calloused from a life of hardship, but his touch was full of a reverence that made her heart ache. "You saved me," he said simply. "In this life, I won't forget it." It was a promise, a vow sworn by a man who had nothing else to give. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. He held her gaze for a moment longer, memorizing her face, the quiet strength in her dark eyes. Then he turned and stepped out into the night. He did not look back. He moved with a surprising stealth for a man his size, melting into the shadows of the foothills as if he were one of them. Aunt May watched until he was completely swallowed by the darkness. She stood at the open door for a long time, letting the cold night air wash over her, a stark contrast to the warmth that had so recently filled her home. Then she closed the door, the latch clicking shut with a sound of profound finality. She was alone again. The cabin, which had felt cramped and small with his presence, now felt cavernously empty. The silence was no longer peaceful. It was a roaring void where his quiet breathing and low voice had been. She walked to the cot and ran her hand over the blanket where he had lain. The danger he had brought was gone, but so was the sense of purpose that had animated her days. She had risked everything for a stranger, and now he was gone, a ghost who had passed through her life. She was left with only the memory of his presence and the terrifying, lingering promise of the marshal's return. She blew out the lamp and sat in the darkness, the weight of her solitude heavier than ever before. She had done the right thing, the humane thing, but as she listened to the wind whispering around the eaves of her lonely cabin, she wondered if she would ever feel safe again. The days that followed were a torment of listening. Every gust of wind sounded like hoofbeats, every shadow a lurking threat. Aunt May found herself holding her breath, her ears strained for any sound that was out of place. She moved the cot back to its original position, scrubbed the floor until no trace of him remained, and tried to force her life back into its old, familiar shape. But the shape was broken. The silence of her home was no longer a comfort. It was a constant, loud reminder of her isolation. The heavy fist on her door. The cold eyes. The heavy fist on her door. The cold eyes searching her face for a flicker of guilt. The brutal tearing apart of her home. She had been so careful, but she knew that a man like Croft was driven by suspicion, and his had been piqued. She began to sleep poorly, her dreams filled with images of Boon being caught, of herself being dragged away, her small, orderly life left in ruins. During the day, she would sit at her embroidery frame, but her fingers felt clumsy, her mind distracted. Her gaze would drift to the window, scanning the vast, indifferent landscape, half hoping, half fearing she might see a sign that Boon had made it safely into the deep wilderness, a sign that her gamble had paid off for him at least, or a sign of the lawmen coming to finish what they had started. She felt a loneliness that was sharper and more painful than anything she had felt since her husband's death. Before Boon, her solitude had been a state of being, a quiet grief she had learned to inhabit. Now it felt like a loss. She missed the quiet presence of the big man, the shared, unspoken understanding that had grown between them. She missed having a purpose that went beyond her own survival. She had stepped out of her carefully constructed world for a brief, terrifying, and vital time, and now, thrust back into it, she found it wanting. The red of her dress felt less like a defiance and more like a beacon, making her feel exposed and vulnerable. She wondered if she had been a fool. Her act of compassion had brought her nothing but fear and a deeper sense of emptiness. As weeks turned into a month and the fierce summer heat began to soften into the first hints of autumn, the sharp edge of her fear began to dull, replaced by a dull, persistent anxiety. The marshal did not return. The mountains kept their secrets. Life, it seemed, was going to simply move on, leaving her with a secret heart and a constant low-grade hum of dread. One morning, when the air had a crisp, clean chill to it, and the rising sun cast long, golden fingers across the valley, Aunt May opened her door to fetch water. She stopped, her hand frozen on the latch. On her doorstep, placed squarely in the center, was a small, dark wooden chest. It was not ornate, but it was well made, its surface smooth and dark. There were no tracks in the dust around it, no sign of who might have left it there. It was as if it had simply appeared out of the pre-dawn mist. Her heart began to pound a frantic, heavy rhythm against her ribs. Her first thought was that it was a trap, left by the marshal to spook her into a confession. But the chest had a quiet dignity to it that didn't feel like the law. It felt familiar. Cautiously she knelt, her fingers tracing its clean lines, on her small table. The same table where she had shared meals with Boon. For a long moment she just stared at it, a vessel of mystery sitting in the center of her quiet life. It could be anything, a threat or a gift, a final ending or a new beginning. With hands that trembled slightly, she reached for the small, simple clasp. It was not locked. She lifted the lid. The morning light streamed through the window, falling upon the contents of the chest. Aunt May gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The interior was lined with worn, dark velvet, and nestled upon it was a treasure that stole her breath. There were gold coins, dozens of them, catching the light with a soft, buttery gleam. There were jewels, deep blue sapphires, fiery rubies, and a string of pearls that glowed with an inner luminescence. It was a fortune, more money and wealth than she had ever seen in her life. It was the proceeds of the robbery Marshal Croft had spoken of. Boon's truth and the marshal's truth all lying together in one box. But as she stared at the glittering hoard, she knew this was not just payment. It was not a reward for her services. It was a message delivered silently across the miles from the heart of the wilderness. It was the fulfillment of a promise. I am safe. I have not forgotten. Your kindness was not in vain. It was the tangible proof of the vow he had made in the darkness. In this life, I won't forget it. He had paid his debt, not just with wealth, but with honor. He had returned to her a piece of the security she had risked for him. She gently closed the lid, the soft click echoing in the quiet room. A single tear escaped and traced a slow path down her cheek, a warm line of relief and profound, aching gratitude. The treasure was not the gold or the jewels. The treasure was the knowledge that her act of mercy had not been lost to the unforgiving wilderness. It had been received, it had been valued, and it had been returned. She looked out the window at the distant, silent mountains, and for the first time in a long time, they did not seem menacing or empty. They seemed like the keepers of a secret, a promise she now shared. The crushing loneliness that had haunted her began to recede, replaced by a quiet, reverent hope. She was still alone, but she was no longer adrift. A connection had been forged in secrecy and danger, and its echo had just returned to her doorstep.